Hey, Jacob. Just going to make copies. I handed this out last week, which is gives you an idea about our Bible study on the book of Job, so you'll know where we are. I'll review it just a little bit, and then we're going to pick up where we left off. Let me see how many of you would like this. Okay, that's what I thought. Good. Let me go over just a little bit. When Jacob gets back, we'll hand out some more. I've got about 8, so whoever smiles the biggest on Sunday morning gets these. Okay, now we'll hand it out when he gets back. But just so you'll know, of course, the way we're approaching the study of Job is God's transforming of Job, and we see that transformation as we move throughout the book. And so right now, of course, we're in that first section on the story of Job. And I told you last time, we're not going to do verse by verse, but there'll be rare sections that we won't cover. I mean, we're going to cover quite a bit of the book of Job, but we're going to do it a little different. And so right now, we're just trying to get the story of Job. And what I wanted to do is look at some key points of application on the front end rather than the back end, where you go, okay, that's what all that was about. I want us to look at some real application points on the front end so that as we move through, it'll kind of be in our minds, okay? And so that's what we're doing right now, and trying to get some background and why things are said the way they are. Then we're going to deal with what I call the characters of the story, so we'll talk in more detail. Now, we'll mention Job's wife and Job and his friends today, and we've been mentioning them as we try to get the story in front of us. But we're really going to break down their profiles a little bit and why they might have said what they said throughout the book of Job and how that contributes to our understanding in various ways. Then, of course, we're going to talk about Job's view of his suffering and his God. So that's where we're really going to get into those, the heart of Job's questions for God or arguments regarding God, or why he feels the way he does, why he says. I mean, some of Job's writings now are pretty forthright. If you haven't read the book of Job, I know most of you probably have, but if you haven't read it in detail, I don't mean read chapter 1 and 2 and then go to the very end. I mean, if you haven't gotten in to Job's protesting the situation, thank you. Just raise your hand and Jacob will get that to you. If you haven't done that, it's pretty aggressive stuff. You know, I mean, he's not holding back at all. Now, on the front end, he seems to be holding back, but then when you really get into his speeches and you're in the heart of Job, we're going to deal with that. And let's see. Then, as we move through that, we're going to talk about Job's friends' speeches. That's where a lot of people kind of get, maybe they feel they're monotonous in some way. There is a method to the madness. There is a reason that they're there. We have this cycle of speeches. Now, they do seem repetitive in some ways, but even that exposes the arguments of the friends, okay? So, we'll break them down. We'll look at Bildad's argument and what he's saying, and we're going to read it and try to appreciate how it fits into this. And you might be surprised, before you throw the friends under the bus, that sometimes we say the same kind of things when maybe something is going on, or we're tempted to say, or have heard people say them. You know, they're not all that unique, but it just didn't fit this situation with Job. And we talked a little bit about retribution theology. We'll mention it again, because that'll be important. And then, and I am really looking forward to, once we move through the story, the characters of the story, Job's view of his suffering with God, the speeches of Job's friends, and of course there's this back and forth that goes on. But then we're going to talk about the divine speeches. And those are very interesting to me. And I think they will be and have been probably to you as well. But there's a lot in there. And while it does include God's power and God's wisdom, and all of that is absolutely true, there is a lot more than God merely saying, hey, don't be questioning me, I'm bigger and stronger than you are. Okay? There's more to those divine speeches than that. Now that's often the way. Now I've got some more. Does anybody else need one? Okay, thank you, Jacob, very much. If you do, they're up here. Oh, okay. You got Here, I'll even give you a second one, Karen. Those divine speeches are a way of God reframing Job's perspective. The model of Job interpreting things was a problem. The way of his friends, even though he was better than his friends, he was holding to his integrity. And God does seem to gently correct Job, whereas he sternly rebukes his friends and says, they have not spoken to me that which is right. So we'll talk about that, but I want to they're very beautiful. Those divine speeches, there's 77 rhetorical questions God asks, and I think that's because he's cushioning the blow. Because he could have just said, this is the case. Boom, 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 boom. That's not what he does. He's trying to teach Job. Okay, so we're going to talk about looking at God as teacher and persuader and the motivation in what he's saying. And of course, Job is transformed. And then finally, we see Yahweh's loving correction of Job and revelation of himself. So that's kind of how it's going to go. Okay? All right. Now then, let's see. Can somebody flip me? Randy, are you back there? Can you hit that? There we go. That's better. Sorry about that. All right, so as we've been moving through, and let me just review a tad here, because I think it was important. When we looked at Job chapter 1, and you have, of course, Job doesn't know about this, but we know about it. When you look at Job chapter 1, and you have this dialogue with God and Satan about Job. And I mentioned to you, I think the book of Job is more about God than it is Job. Okay. And so when you have that dialogue, what argument was Satan making? James?
God put a hedge around and protect him, wouldn't let nothing happen to him.
Yeah, so let's get back. That's true. And that's a true statement, by the way. God did put a hedge around Job. He had provided for Job. He does often bless the faithful. Okay, so that is the statement. What's the underlying implication that he's trying to argue? Because James is exactly right. That's what he says. But if we, this is like Satan. He takes a factual, accurate thing, but he's twisting it into something else. Go ahead. Yeah, that's the implication. Is that what you were going to say, Gary? So that's the argument. And let's go a little further with it, okay? Number one, he says, well, you put a hedge of protection around him, like James said. But then the implication is the reason he serves you isn't because he really loves you. It's because you've blessed him. He's not going to bite the hand that feeds him, as we would say. So you've put this hedge of protection. You've blessed him. If you take that away, what does he say Job's going to do? Yeah, he's going to do what Satan would do in his mind, and that is curse God to your face. Well, as you think about that, what he's also saying, this is also an onslaught on God. The way you're handling Job, you'll never know what you say is true. We'll never know. Because as long as the blessings are there, who's to say? Okay. So, there's that argument. Job, as you get deeper into Job, now he doesn't know about all this conversation. How is he going to feel about having the rug pulled out from underneath him? That's what it feels like to him. First you have his family being affected, his livestock being affected, his status. Status is a big deal, and that's all getting jerked away from Job. You know what I mean by status. What you own, who you are, your identity in your family, and all this stuff is happening. And he's pretty gracious about that. And Satan comes back and says, God's initial limitation was, Satan, you can't do what initially? You can't touch Job. You can do all this other stuff to him, but you can't touch him. But then he comes back and he says, well, if I could, basically afflict him, then he'll curse you to your face. So God lets him do that. But now what's the restriction? Can't kill him. And that's where we are for most of the book. But you have to remember, Job does not know that he's not going to die. Okay, he just knows this is terrible, terrible, terrible suffering for him. And he feels that God has targeted him. Now I'm telling you what Job felt. That's what he says. Okay. Now then, Okay, so Job's feeling is, Satan's saying, well, as long as you bless them, how do we know they really love you? But Job's feeling is, why would you target the faithful? I mean, why would you not bless the faithful? I don't understand it. It seems counterintuitive. If they're your children, why wouldn't you bless them? Okay. So you have these things going on. The friend's viewpoint is going to be, if we just boiled it really down, what is it going to be? Yeah. Now let's talk for just a moment, before we get back in our application points, which is going to involve some of this. And we talked at detail about this, but this is important all the way through the book of Job. Okay? I cannot overemphasize this. Why would they, sometimes we read that and we go, why would they say that? Those terrible friends. I mean, why would they say, Job, you must have sinned? Or there's some different nuances, but that's fundamentally it. What were they thinking? So what were they thinking?
In their eyes, they correlated the acts that were happening to Job to a punishment rather than a blessing.
Now, let me go with that. So, and that's basically what we call retribution theology. People get what they deserve. Now, do they sometimes get what they deserve? Yeah. Is it true that even Israel, in Israel's history, there were times God poured out, wrathful judgments on them for their rebellion, and they got what they deserved from God? Yeah. They also got what they didn't deserve in His grace and His blessings and His mercy too. But this model, and even we mentioned last week, Jesus' disciples, remember the blind man? What did they say in John 9? Yeah, there was no third option that they give. It's like, okay, who messed up? Him or his mom and dad? That's retribution theology. That there must have been something. And we do see that pattern. I want to make that clear. We do see that in Scripture. But, and this is one of the great things about the book of Job, and we notice that Proverbs says that kind of thing. That good people get blessed and unfaithful people will receive punishments of some kind, and sometimes that's true. We know ultimately it will be true for everyone, don't we? However, that model doesn't work in every case, and I would even say in many cases, in this time gap between here and eternity. And that's where we get in trouble. When you take people take kind of a biblical model of looking at something, and then they try to make that the end all and apply it to every single situation. And some of those situations it just doesn't apply to. And God is not restricted to your model. God wasn't restricted to what the friends thought. Now, He sometimes may operate in that way of acting and interacting with mankind, but not always. And so basically what they're looking at is they're saying, well, it either has to be God or Job, and it can't be God because we know God is holy, right? So it must be Job. It's got to be Job. And that's how they're reasoning. And they can't get their minds outside of the model. Now later, God's going to say they've been wrong. They were wrong about that. Now we have some background information. We don't have all the background information, but we've got some that they didn't have. And I would think his wife was thinking similarly, like, how's this working out for you? And you have to remember, she had lost a lot too. And we'll talk more about that. And it's true, the devil works through people, and he is working through her. But sometimes we don't think about her perspective. She was ready to get this over with. When she says, curse God and die. And there's a conversation we'll look at there. And Job knows in the integrity of his heart, or feels that it is not him, that he has not been some rebellious sinner against God. And so, who's left for him to cry out to? Why are you doing this? God! Yeah. And he's kind of in the same model. It's just, it's not working. It's not working very well for him. So, we have all of that, and we talked about that. But what I want to do in the rest of our time, with that in the background and that understanding, is let's talk through, and I just flashed these up real fast, but I wanted to take the time to talk through some of what I call the theological issues in Job, things that I think are very beneficial to us, that are helpful to us to think about. And one of the first things, if you look at Job 1, and we're looking at verse 12 through chapter 2 and verse 10, is the fact, and this is something we see in the New Testament, we certainly see it in the life and story of Job and throughout the Old Testament, but suffering really does reveal the condition of our faith. It really does. In a way that if suffering were not there, it would be hard for us to see. Okay. Now, it's interesting, in the New Testament we're told that suffering refines our faith even, makes it better. And when it comes out on the other side, it's more precious, Peter says in 1 Peter 1, 6 through 9. And we know that it also actually renews our faith. That sounds different, but we have that in 2 Corinthians 4, that suffering actually renews our faith as a faithful Christian. But there is a real sense in which it reveals our faith as well. 1 Corinthians 3 talks about different elements of those who have been converted. Paul's talking about the fact that there's some who are hay and straw, and there's some that will be gold and silver, and the fire reveals that. The fire, if you have something that's gold, it's going to be more precious, even after the fire. But if you're dealing with hay, what's going to happen when fire comes? Yeah, it's going to burn it up. It's going to burn it up. What does the fire do? Now, you could say, well, is that the final judgment? There's a sense in which it is, but I think it also applies to these fiery trials right now. Those trials reveal our faith, and that's what we see from Job. So when you look at Job 1, and I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and read Job 1:12, and I want to read all the way down through chapter 2 and verse 10. Job 1:12 through chapter 2 and verse 10. Bo, just read that section if you could. Job 1:12 through 2:10.
And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And the messenger came to Job and said, The oxen of God and the donkeys feeding beside him. And the Sabians raided him and took him away. Indeed, they had killed the servant with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another came and said, The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servant and consumed it. I alone have escaped to tell you. While I was still speaking, another also came and said, The Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, and took them away. Yes, and killed the servant with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While I was still speaking, another also came and said, Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell on the young people, and they were dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And Job arose, tore his robe, and shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped. And he said, Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And all that Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, From where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. And the Lord said to Satan, Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and does good. And still he holds fast to his integrity, although he decided to be against him to destroy him without cause. So Satan answered the Lord and said, Skin for skin, yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand now, and touch his bone with his flesh, and he will surely curse you through your face. The Lord said to Satan, Behold, it is in your hand, but spare his life. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with painful blows from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took for himself a potsherd with which to scrape himself while he sat in the midst of the ashes. And his wife said to him, You still hold fast to your integrity. Curse God and die. But he said to her, one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? And all this Job did not sin with his lips.
Okay, so we're on the front end of things right here. What's interesting to you about Job's response? What do these things reveal about his faith? And just think about that for a minute before you answer. I think it was Dino who brought up to me, it's interesting when you read it has Satan roaming about, but it's almost as if God is pretty assertive in coming to Satan and saying, what about Job? Do you notice that? It's not like God is on his heels with this thing, or somehow Satan has cornered, the Lord. The Lord very clearly is saying, hey, have you considered Job? And so God's not ashamed of Job. He's not worried about saying, have you thought about Job? He knows Job's character. Okay, Alan?
Yeah, I was having a similar thought about that. It's kind of like a predetermined counsel of God, where there's a lesson that mankind needs, and He's going to use Satan's conniving ways to teach that lesson. And,
Right.
And Job needed it, and we all need it.
Right.
And so it wasn't as if God was just this happened to God, and He was somehow reacting to it.
Right. And that's important to recognize that God, being outside of time, can act within time for His purposes. And so when you think there's other passages about, even if you think about the crucifixion of Christ, and the Bible talks about how Jesus was slain before the foundation of the world, that's talking about in the mind of God. Well, God knew how unrighteous men were going to interact with His Son. And He could even use, talking about being able to use their conniving ways to provide redemption. So that is interesting. Sometimes we try to apply our limitations to God. And that's one of the great lessons of the book of Job, is you can't do that. That the book of Job reveals God's ability to transcend our wisdom or our understanding or our capabilities. And so when you try to understand every minute detail about every aspect of this eternal divine being, you're always going to come out on the short end of the stick. And I think Job is going to learn that. Job's going to learn that in a very clear and profound way. But it is interesting that, Job probably feels like somehow God has targeted him to punish him, but what he doesn't know is that God is, if I could use the word proud in the way that you're thinking of, His confidence in Him is such that He's holding him up to the wicked one. Okay, so it's not at all probably what Job would have perceived, and I don't know that Job ever came to understand all of the context of why this happens, but he comes to surrender to God. Okay, Billy.
I also wonder, when all said and done, it's like really this is a schooling lesson for Satan.
Yes.
And so I just wonder, what do you think in that overall picture? Yeah, you can tell man, but does this have in some ways a shadowing of Christ being able to resist him? It's like, what is the lesson He's really trying to teach Satan? Other than, he's a good man. It's interesting to me that God just kind of calls him and says, let's do some schooling.
Right. What about Job? It does. Now, there's a lot of humanity that would fit into what Satan is saying, that he's enticed to feel that way, but not everybody. Not Job. And it is interesting about Christ that the writer of Romans mentions the fact that, and I know it's talking about His offering and all of that, but He condemned sin in the flesh. There's significance in that statement that Jesus condemned sin in the flesh. He exposed the fact that what sin is and was the offering for sin and did not fall short in any way as the Son of God. And it says He condemned sin in the flesh. So I do think Satan is being exposed here. The overly simplified theology and viewpoints and perspectives of the friends is being exposed. Job's own kind of simplified feeling about it. It is the way he felt, and it wasn't completely illogical based on his perspective. There's nothing terrible. God never says, "Oh, Job, you're just the most terrible sinner ever." He does, and He corrects him, but He doesn't say that. So there's a lot of people that in all of this, and this goes, and I think Billy brings up the point that all of these people are going to have to learn. Now, Satan is wicked, but the friends and Job and all of that, you see these short-sighted views of God, and not the diversity of God and just the wisdom and power and love and care that so far goes beyond our immediate situation. We tend to try to judge everything about God based on our immediate situation. That's kind of human and normal and natural. But I think what the point of Job is, you cannot come to a conclusion about the love of God in its entirety and comprehensiveness that way. It's hard not to fall into that trap, but I think that's part of the story. Go ahead.
I guess kind of in that same line and the retribution theology, it is trying to always tie this with Christ. I don't mean that, but on the other hand, it is one of the earliest examples of God showing that no, a righteous man can be despised by man. He can be humiliated. He can, so there's Christ who took on all the shame, the cross and the shame that we did, but yet was righteous.
Right. Well, when God becomes flesh, we see how sinful men interact with that. Not very well. And I do think there's some lessons there. But even Job, now we know Job was not sinless, but that's not really, I don't think that's the point. I think the point is he was faithful. And God could hold up a faithful man and say, he loves me. And you can do these things. I'm going to put some restrictions. You can do these things. We're going to see if he really loves me. And God knew his character. And Satan was wrong about Job. He was just wrong about him. So that's encouraging to me. But it is true, the trial reveals the nature of our faith. Anybody else? Go ahead, Todd.
Can you put Hebrews 12 on the chastening of the Lord with this story of Job?
I'd have to think about that. Do you put it there?
Somewhat.
Yeah.
I mean, those Hebrew brethren, they were enduring affliction.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's not that they were just living in sin.
Right. Yeah.
But he chastened them, not to strengthen, in order to strengthen them.
Right.
And he says,
Well,
you
I see what you're
endure,
saying.
For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth.
Right.
God dealeth with you as with his son. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? He looks upon him as his children.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Strengthening.
Yeah, and
It's not that they did anything wrong,
right.
but he strengthened through the chastening.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because he even mentions you haven't striven to the point of bloodshed, which alludes to Jesus. Yeah, I see what you're saying. And now let me make this point, and this is important. I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the sermon this morning, but James mentions that God cannot be tempted with evil, but that's talking about the enticement to sin. All right. But prior to that in James 1, he's been talking about trials. Now, he says God does not, James' point is God does not try to entice us to do evil. Satan does that, and the flesh can do that. But does God test us and tempt us in essence? Well, obviously he does. He did that throughout the Old Testament. What was he doing with Abraham? He wasn't trying to get Abraham to do evil. He was testing him, like Todd said, to reveal his faith and to renew him and to bring him to courage. The same, you can have this. Let's take Job. You have the same situation where there is a testing going on, and that testing reveals Job's faithfulness. Okay, and even Job's going to grow. That's our point. He's going to come to learn more about God. Okay, that's God's perspective. It's what He wants out of it. But the same situation, what is Satan trying to use the situation for? Not to build Job's faith, to get him to fall and destroy him. So the point is, you can have trials, and within those outward trials, Satan can be trying to use those to entice us to do evil or to give up or not to continue in faithfulness. And yet God has a completely different perspective. He's not trying to destroy me. He, as a loving Father, is trying to develop me. And I do think that's important for us to know, even in our lives, that we've got different parties operating in the same situation. Okay, and we have to be sensitive to that and realize what's going on. And if you get that out of sync, I think you might be tempted to come to wrong conclusions about things. Okay, James?
Well, I think Job was thinking about, God appreciated the curse the day that he was born. He's looking back thinking, I must have done something wrong. And we look at Acts when Paul was bit by the serpent, they Yeah, he must have been bad. Look, he got mad, he's gonna die, but what happened, he did.
Are you saying that Job thought he had done something wrong?
No, I said Job sort of thought that, I think.
I don't think he did.
I was just sort of
I-
giving to me, sort of thought, okay, I must be doing something evil.
Yeah, no, I don't think he ever thought that.
Okay.
And let me tell you why. His friends thought that.
It seems like it to me.
Okay, well, I'll tell you why. I'm with you. But his friends thought that. But Job all the way through, when it talks about Job holding to the integrity of his heart, and we may be saying the same thing two different ways, but I don't think, because that's the friends wanted to say, Job, you've sinned, and this is a punishment from God. And Job refused to acquiesce to that. Job is never going to say, yeah, you guys are right, I've sinned, God's punishing me. In fact, Job holding to this fact that can't be the right answer is the way in which he held to the integrity of his heart. Okay, and I think, now, but to your point, it's as if you're treating me as though I have sinned, even though I haven't. This is how Job, and when we read some of Job's speeches, that is inescapable, I think, especially when he talks about he feels targeted by God. Okay? So that will be interesting when we get further into that. But I had a couple of hands before I get to Todd. Go ahead.
I'm going to open up the question of free will can of worms, because I know that's probably going to come up eventually. It seems that God's, in his divine speeches, he's saying to Job, I am worthy of praise because of who I am and what I've done. In the great battle of good versus evil, Satan is trying to get souls, and God is trying to get souls.
Mm-hmm.
And God's argument to Satan is, I am worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And because of my worthiness, if I give man free will, he would choose me because I'm worthy. Whereas man may be tempted to choose you because of things that are happening to him, things that I am allowing to happen. He could have made us all automatons and has this overriding will that, again, to dive further into Calvinism.
Yeah, I got you. Predetermination of some kind, yeah.
That is the argument, is I am worthy of praise. And man's failure to praise me is not a failure on my part.
Right.
That is a failure of man.
I would say and I'm with you, Joel, the nuance I might put on that, I think it's what you're saying is, I think God is saying a faithful man will praise me regardless of what's. Now, unfaithful men may not, like you said, because they get caught up in looking at things in the way that they do, and there is free will. You can choose A or B. But God seems to have this confidence in Job's character. Now, he had confidence in Abraham's character too, but it didn't mean Abraham didn't make some big-time mistakes. He did. But I do think you see that battle, you're right, that's rooted in free will. If it's all predetermined and Job doesn't have much of a choice, none of this makes a whole bunch of sense. Yeah, and I think that's a valuable point. Okay, Todd, what were you going to say?
I think you've already mentioned it, but I believe it's important throughout this whole book to know that Job was not privy of the conversation, either conversation between God and Satan about him.
Right.
He did not have a clue
No.
what they talked about.
And I think I'll mention this more later to your point, but it's important for us to know that we don't know all things about the spiritual realm. Okay, so when we act like we know all the minute details about what may be going on in the spiritual realm, we got to be careful with that. That's a good point. Go ahead, Al.
We're talking about Job had not sinned, and we said this earlier in classes. He had sinned. He just wasn't living a life of sin.
Right. Right.
He was living in a world that had been affected by sin as well.
Yeah.
Different thought also about when God said, don't touch his life. Sometimes we think that was limiting Satan. I think that was actually giving Satan more reign.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, death would have been a blessing to Job at that point. Righteous man dies. I mean, but there was more to the story that needed to happen after his suffering. And,
Right.
Satan may have thought that as a limitation, but it was actually,
Yeah,
it was actually extending the story and the suffering somewhat.
I think his suffering is going to be, when we get into his speeches, there's going to be descriptions of the kind of suffering we're talking about, and this is no light matter. I mean, he was a dead man walking that wouldn't die. Okay, I mean, this is tough stuff. So, I think there's a good point that there is he is saying don't kill him, but sometimes death is to be preferred over some kinds of suffering, just to be honest. I think that's why his wife said, why don't you curse God and die? Yeah, go ahead. What were we pointing? Go ahead.
So, the other perspective is we see his friends talking about what Job must have done by just looking at Job's condition. But, just think about also the tendency of Job's whole family just got killed. I mean,
Yeah.
this has to be a wicked family, that you go, something has to be going on in that household.
Oh, the friends would have said that, I think.
That's what I mean,
Yeah.
giving him credit in that sense.
I didn't want to bore you with all this, but I read a lot of articles about the role of status in society that would have existed in the life of Job, because many think he would have been riding around the patriarchal time. She feels like she's lost everything. Children, land, money, livestock, property, again, status. It is all gone. And she looks at her husband, and he's just suffering terribly. And if you're thinking God blesses the faithful, you're going, something's not working here. And so she says, curse God and die. So yes, she's wrong, and Job's going to expose that. We'll talk more about that. But I think you got to leave it in the context of the story, too. And James, back to your point, to tie in what Alan said, I'm not saying that Job was sinless, but I don't believe Job, in the integrity of his heart, ever acquiesced to the charge that he was guilty of sin, and thus this was happening because of that. And that's what his friends wanted him to agree to. I mean, they just kept coming back. But this whole thing is turning that retribution idea on its head, and later on, God, he does correct Job, but he rebukes the friends that they were wrong. Okay. Let's move on. Did anybody else have a question or comment before we move? Okay, go ahead, Darryl.
The question always comes to my mind when I read through this. Satan was wrong about Job. No doubt about it. But statistically, Satan may have been right about mankind in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and
God is away.
Yeah. How do I say this? Satan tends, you're right, there is a pattern of humanity's rebellion and sin, and it's through Christ that we receive forgiveness of that. But he's appealing to those base desires and actions, and assuming that about Job. And he did that in the temptation of Christ. If you go back and look at the temptation of Christ, and Deuteronomy is quoted, Satan's abuse of Scripture and that kind of thing is an Israel story, and he's assuming he can get Christ to do what Israel did. And it didn't work. It didn't work at all. So, anyway. All right. Let's move on. So this kind of goes with what we have been saying. God has divine purposes in His allowance of suffering that we may not be aware of in our human understanding. That certainly is the case with Job. And we have to be careful trying to apply every situation we know to, it must be like Job. But it is worth our attention that in this case, going to what Todd said, Job never, I don't know of in the book where Job ever by the way, Job, there was a conversation between me and Satan. I just want you to know what was really going on. That never happens. God surrenders to God in His greatness even though He doesn't have all the answers. So, true faith doesn't mean I have all the answers to every minute question that may possibly exist. That's not that mechanical view of faith is not what faith is. Okay? We have some answers that God has revealed about Himself to us. But there are limitations. Was that my first bell? Second. Who is ringing that thing? Okay, let me do this. We've covered this, okay? Now we're going to go here next. So we're going to, I do want to hit these lessons, and we're going to kind of roll through these lessons that we need to learn from this story, because we're going to kind of jump in the deep end after that. Okay, so just hang with me here, because this should help us kind of move through in a beneficial way. Okay, we'll stop there.